I told him not to say that last part. Well, I don't know how many of you have seen the movie Titanic, but you know when the ship starts going down and they're loading people on the lifeboats, remember that phrase that kept saying over and over? Women and children first. Women and children first. Well, that's sort of the unspoken motto of a church these days. You know, women and children first. Men, you're not really needed. You're not really wanted around here. But are men really that expendable? You know, throughout history, it's usually been men who have bravely fought, even given up their lives for their tribe or nation. Men have usually been the ones that have pushed us, humankind, into the future, sailing ships across the ocean into the unknown, constructing cities, inventing the printing press, the railroad, electricity, the automobile, the airplane, leading our country to greatness through strong government and business leadership, creating the most powerful nation in the world today. Well, I'm glad you're here as we talk about why men hate going to church. Now, last week we said that although the U.S. population is almost evenly balanced between men and women, 50-50, the ratio seen in American church is quite a bit different. In fact, this predominantly female pattern holds up all around the world, and in many cases is a lot more extreme than here. Now, last week I mentioned how in contrast, in Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, and Islam, they all attract more men than women. However, I also mentioned that those religious beliefs consider men to be much superior to women. In fact, there's a devaluation and a subjugation of women to men. Maybe that's why they attract more men. But that is not the case with Christianity. In the Christian faith, women are just as important, just as valued to God as men are. This point is made in a New Testament verse, Galatians 3:28, when it lists three things: racial distinctions, economic differences, and gender distinctions. And it says, in the church, or those of us who are in Christ, are one. In other words, Jews were not more important than Gentiles. The rich were not more important than the poor. And men were not supposed to be superior to women. But then why is there this discrepancy today in the number of men and women in church? And did you also know that older people attend church much more frequently than younger people? You probably know that. Well, today we want to go beyond the polls, beyond the statistics, and ask why. Why is it that so many men in particular, and young people also, do not like going to church? What are the barriers? What are the obstacles that have driven them away? And this might apply to you, to your dad, your grandfather, your children, people that you know, people that are important to you. Well, I would say the number one reason that men don't go to church is because of previous church experiences that were unpleasant. It was boring. The services and the sermons were too long. They felt it was irrelevant, didn't have anything to do with their real lives. The music was bad. The pews were uncomfortable. They didn't get the rituals. It's kind of like if you don't like going fishing and someone invites you to go, you're very unlikely to say yes. If you hate putting the minnow or the worm on the hook, if you hate to touch slippery, scaly fish, if you hate the smell of fish, or getting dirty or seasick or sunburned or frozen, if you don't even like to eat fish, it's not a hard decision. Somebody asks, hey, you want to go fishing? No, I don't. You know how you know they don't want to go? Because they've been fishing before. That's how they know they don't want to go. How do men know that they don't want to go to church? Because they've been before. A second why has to do with the belief that they will have to give up more than they will gain. Men fear that they'll have to give up all the fun stuff, all the things that they enjoy doing in life, even the freedom to run their own lives. They're convinced that living for God means nothing but rules and regulations and restrictions. And when you talk about freedom, you're talking about something that is very important to American males. They like to do what they want to do and say what they want to say and go where they want to go, and they don't want the government or their boss or even God telling them how to run their lives. A part of which is the perception of that God's commandments are just arbitrary anyway. You know, many people view God's laws kind of like some of the laws that you hear about that were established long ago but are somehow still on the books. Like in San Francisco, it's still illegal to wash one's car using used underwear. That's illegal. In Chino, California, Detonating a nuclear device within city limits results in a $500 fine. And in Anchorage, Alaska, it's a misdemeanor to push a live moose out of a moving airplane. There are lots of these. When people view God's laws like that, they don't make any sense. They're just arbitrary. They're outdated. Or maybe it's just the rules they perceive the churches have. You have to dress up. You know, you have to smile and be friendly to everybody. You have to be very quiet. And you have to say good sermon to the pastor on the way out, no matter how bad it was. And a lot of guys just hate all that stuff. Another thing that's keeping men and younger people away from church is the fear that if they ever got serious about spiritual matters, they would have to become some kind of religious fanatic. Now, the fact is, there are some, I'm sure very well-meaning, but there are some really weird Christians around. You know, overzealous, obnoxious, social misfits. Well, you know, if that turns you off when you see that, can you imagine what that does to an unchurched person? Even if they had thoughts about God or whatever, they would have to wonder, would I have to become like that? You know, and if I did, what are my friends going to think? What are my family members or my coworkers going to think if I show up and suddenly I'm this religious fanatic? All right, another thing that sometimes keeps men away from church and God and all that is the feeling that why should I make a commitment that I already know I can't keep? You know, I'm not going to be able to do everything right, and I'm certainly not going to be another hypocrite. You know, go to church and act real spiritual when I know deep down I'm not perfect and never will be perfect. Then there's a lot of men that are simply feel like they're too busy. Their lives are too busy. In Luke chapter 14, Jesus one day confronted some men that were not making time for God in their busy lives. And Jesus right out challenged them, "Come and follow me," he said. One guy said, "Jesus, I'd love to, but you know, I've got an important business I'm building right now. I don't have time for spiritual commitments." Another man said, "Well, I have to attend to family matters. You know, I'm interested in God, but maybe later, maybe some other time." Along a similar line, some men don't have an interest in church because they're achieving success in life fine without God. In Mark chapter 10, there's a story of a guy known as the rich young ruler, and he fit that description. He was young, he was very successful financially, and he had a lot of influence with people. So he comes to Jesus and he says, hey, it kind of says, in effect, I think we have a lot in common. We're both young, we're both leaders in our chosen fields, and we're both religious. And it says in this passage, if you look it up sometime, that Jesus kind of liked this guy. He sort of felt an affinity with him. And so Jesus never wanted to miss an opportunity to correct a misperception. He said, you know, if you want to get to heaven, your religious heritage and your good deeds are not the way there. And he said also, I hate to say it, but your life seems to be a little too oriented around yourself rather than the things of God. And the rich young ruler kind of says, yeah, I know God should have a bigger place in my life, but I'm on a roll right now. You know, I'm in the prime of my life. Maybe later when I get older. Maybe sometime when my life slows down a little bit, then maybe I'll make time for God. Another reason there's a shortage of men in most churches today is the popular misperception that, hey, I've tried to live a good life. I'm honest. I don't cheat on my wife or beat my kids. I'm a good person. I don't need church to help me be a good person. Then there's the belief, and I mentioned this last week, that you kind of have to check your mind in at the door when you go to church. In other words, like in the old days in a restaurant that was real fancy, they'd take your coat and they'd put it in a closet. When you'd come back out, you'd get it and then you'd leave. A lot of well-educated men kind of see church that way. You go in, well, you better just set your mind at the door because you're going to have to just accept everything on blind faith around here. They view Christians as gullible and naive. And to them, there's just this big intellectual disconnect that seems expected and required when you go to church. And they just can't do that. Now, here's a reason that you might not think about, but some men might be afraid of going to heaven. Think about it. What man wants to spend eternity wearing a white robe, floating on clouds, plucking a harp? That does not sound like a great time. They may have a fear of heaven. It's so dull. There's no sports. There are no cars. There's no fun. There's no challenge. There's nothing to do. Well, I take that back. There is one thing to do in heaven. Sing. Sing. Little kids are told in the children's choir, you better get to like singing because that's all we're going to do in heaven. So that really sounds fun to a lot of men. That's all we're going to spend an eternity singing in the choir. Now, by and large, most men don't like to sing. All right, just look around you some Sunday, and when you stand up here, you can see it. People have been coming to church for 20 years. They still don't sing. They don't even pretend to move their lips like they're singing. They just they're not going to sing. And also, the music in most churches is so lame. It's so safe. Did you know those radio stations that play romantic, easy listening love songs? 67% of their audience, women. Rock and roll stations, their audience is 70% male. Well, I'm not done. I have a few more reasons that men don't go to church. The next is that most men respect excellence and have little patience for mediocrity. And yet, what do they see when they go to the typical church? Unkept grounds, facilities in desperate need of repair, mismatched secondhand furniture, poor quality printed materials. Next, and you might not think about this, but most men can't stand people soft-selling or compromising the truth. Now, it used to be in our country that pastors and churches served as sort of the conscience of society. They weren't afraid to say there is a right and a wrong. There are some moral absolutes established by God. Nowadays, pastors and churches sound more like politicians than they do prophets, always wanting to please everyone. Never step on anyone's toes. Tell people what they want to hear, not necessarily what they need to hear. Never offend anyone. Always be politically correct, even when it's not biblically correct. And most men hate that mamby-pamby, apologetic approach. Even if they disagree with someone, they respect someone who will at least stand up for what they believe in. Along a similar line, most men have no respect for what might be called scaredy-cat leadership. What that is the overly cautious, guarded, conservative way that decisions are made in most churches. Oh, we'd better not do that. That's a great idea, but there are 3 or 4 people, they're really going to be offended, so we can't do it. Oh, it's always better to play it safe. Let's not upset anyone's apple cart. Let's not set any goals, because if we don't reach them, people would feel terrible. We don't want people to feel terrible. Last week we talked about the feminization of the church. That began about 700 years ago, where the feminine, softer, gentler sides of Jesus, or Christian traits, were much more valued and seen as much more spiritual than some of the more masculine, bold, or assertive side of Jesus. Well, nowhere is this seen more than in the church of today in the area of leaderships and decision making. Now, I remember about 15 years ago, I did one of my Bob Dylan impersonations, and we take a lot of liberty with the songs when we do this, and so we made up some verses and stuff, one of which questioned the IQ of OSU fans. All right? It was one part of a whole song. It lasted maybe 8 seconds, just this one little part. Well, that week I was informed that there were some people who were really upset about that. And I remember saying, oh, yeah, right. And they go, no, really. People were upset. They were offended. Well, that week I go to what's called an elders meeting, and we spent 2 hours talking about how we need to be very careful and not say or do anything that might offend anyone. And I'm like, well, number one, this is Norman, home of the University of Oklahoma. OSU people expect that, just like we would if we go up there to a game, right? Number two, I said, of the hundreds of people who were there, 3 or 4 people gripe. And so now joking around about OSU is off limits. And 3, I said, it was a joke. You see? It was said in fun, in a silly Bob Dylan impersonation with a lot of other joke-type things. So I said, this didn't go over well, but I said, rather than us stop doing fun things, maybe that tiny fraction of people who were supposedly really upset should stop being so ridiculously oversensitive. And you know the result. Some of you know the result. That wasn't the main part, but that probably didn't help. But I'm telling you, that's how leadership in a lot of churches work. It's like, oh, don't do anything. Oh, that would offend one person. It's like, well, what can you do then, So scaredy cat leadership causes churches to always take the safe, overly cautious path. Like, build a new building. Oh, that's going to be expensive. People won't want to ask to give money. Reach out to spiritually lost people. Oh, well, we're going to have to serve more. Or maybe even make the Sunday services more about them than about us. People won't like that. They'll complain. So when you think about it, it's not that hard really to understand why a lot of men and young people stay away from church. If it's boring, if it seems totally irrelevant to your life, if the services and sermons seem to go on forever, if you lose the freedom to run your own life, if you can't have fun anymore, if you have to turn into an obnoxious, intolerant religious fanatic, you have to give up your Sundays, have to sit in an unkept building listening to someone sugarcoat everything so that as to be politically correct and never inadvertently offend anybody with the truth. If you have to sing songs that you don't understand that are way more the style of Celine Dion than Led Zeppelin, no wonder most guys are not real thrilled about making that a part of their weekly routine. All right, I've got a couple more. Why men hate going to church? Well, this little graphic here kind of explains, I think, if we have it, yeah, why men often don't get involved and feel home in a typical church. Even men who really do love God and want to honor God, they often can't figure out where or if they fit. Men are like square pegs trying to fit into a sea of round holes. Now, most jobs in churches require the skills that women are really good at. You know, verbal, relational skills, teaching, working with children, having a heart of compassion. Very few jobs in churches tap into the skills that men tend to have, like, you know, working the remote control, passing gas, or driving real fast. Those are not called on in the church. And generally speaking, most men hate to be outshone by women. But it happens all the time in churches. Women are just fabulous at doing church. They just show up and they're just great at church. And men feel incompetent. And you know, that's a real tragedy. Because most men have an internal desire, a drive even, to do something significant with their lives. To do something good. To do something important with their lives. Recently, my sister, who lives in Ardmore, sent me an obituary that had a rather unusual sentence in it. After listing this person's birth, family, etc., there was only one part that wasn't just names, places, and dates. One little part that told us who this woman was who had just passed away. Here's the sentence. She attended Trinity Baptist Church and was an avid Walmart shopper. Quite a legacy. She attended church and she liked to go to Walmart. Now, most people, men and women, but I think especially men, want their lives to count for something. They want to make a difference somehow in their lives. And the tragedy is that most men would never even think or imagine that the church might be a place where they could do that. When in reality, the church is the only organization on planet Earth where people can make a difference now, in this life, in the lives of people, and a difference that lasts all throughout eternity. There's nowhere else except in the cause of Christ where we can make that kind of difference. And when the stakes are heaven and hell, when people's lives in eternity hang in a balance, you can't do any more thing insignificant in your life than that. And I was kidding a moment ago when I said that men's set of skills only, contain flipping channels or driving real fast. Men have many qualities and strengths that church desperately need. For instance, men are almost always trying to improve things, make things better. Well, churches need that. Men are always building things, whether it's physical, building structures, or systems to improve efficiency or effectiveness, or building teams. And churches need that. Men make things happen. Men know how to work hard. They aren't scared usually to take a few risks and challenge the status quo. Men can take churches to places and to accomplishing things that were never dreamed of. And yet most men don't feel needed or wanted in the church. And so they take all of those great God-given qualities and strengths and use them to build businesses and to bring success to other organizations and causes. But in Ecclesiastes 3, verse 11, the Bible gives, I think, a very interesting insight into the male psyche. It said, God has set eternity in the hearts of men. That desire to make a difference, to have significance in your life, can only be experienced in its fullest when it connects to and resonates with that eternal component that God has set in the hearts of men and women. But this verse says men, and if only men could see that the church, the cause of Christ, is a place where they can find their greatest significance. Okay, just one more reason why men have an aversion to church, and that is that men have a tendency to be very independent and self-sufficient. And at church, they're told that they must humble themselves and acknowledge they need God. There was a book that came out a while back called Real Men Don't Eat Quiche by Bruce Fierstein. Here's a few examples of what he said real men don't do. Real men don't floss. Real men don't use zip codes on mail. Kind of like the turn signal deal, I guess. Of course, men don't cry. In baseball, real men don't bunt. And in football, real men never call for a fair catch. Glenn Hall is a hockey goalie. He once guarded the net for 522 consecutive games in professional hockey without wearing a face mask. Now that's a real man. One time he was hit in the face with a puck and dropped unconscious to the ice. They hauled him off on a stretcher. One period later, he was back guarding the net with 23 stitches, 2 black eyes, and still no face mask. That's supposed to be a real man right there. But when men come to church, they're told, that's not what a real man is. A real man is sensitive and kind and humble and self-effacing. And they're told they need to humble themselves and admit they need God and ask for forgiveness and ask for God's wisdom and guidance in their life. And my suspicion and fear is that there will be an inordinate number of men in hell someday because most men don't want to humble themselves before God. Now the reality is that the old cliche that Christianity is for weak people could not be further from the truth. What's easy for women, young people, and men, what's easy is to follow the crowd. What's easy is just to do what you want to do all the time, to live the way you want to live. The easy way is to build your self-confidence on how physically strong or tough you are. What's hard is to be a man of God. Not just strong and tough physically, but strong and tough spiritually. What's hard is to be a person of integrity. A man of inner strength, a man who does what needs to be done, not just what he wants to do all the time. A man strong enough in who he is to admit, I am a sinner, and I do need God. A man with a kind of love that sacrifices for others. That's what's hard to do. It's hard to be that kind of man. What time in the Old Testament we read where it says that Saul went to his home accompanied by valiant men whose hearts God had touched. And you know, that's what I think the church should be calling men to. Valiant men whose hearts God has touched. Now last week I mentioned I was going to give you an incredible statistic today, and here it is. When a mom alone, not the dad, just the mom, takes her faith seriously, 17% of the time her children will follow her example. When a dad alone, and not the mom, takes his faith seriously, his kids will follow his example 93% of the time. Now why that's true, I don't know. But it means for all of us guys here, and especially those of us that are dads, or granddads, God is calling you to follow him in a very real way, to live out your faith 24/7. No matter what the mainstream of men in our society may be doing, we got to be the ones that are swimming upstream and taking a stand and being the kind of people that God wants us to be. All right, we are going to end the service with a special Manly Man video. I cannot take any responsibility for anything that happens in the next couple of minutes.
We're men among men and manly men, yes, manly men are we. We're men among manly men, manly men are we. We'll sail up north and cross the ice and cross the barren snow fields. You gotta be tough and you gotta be a man to club the baby harp seals. To club the baby harp seals. We're men among men and manly men, yes, manly men are we. We're men among manly men, manly men are we. We'll drive out west on a buffalo hunt in adventure, bold and daring. We'll shoot one again and again and again while the others stand there staring. While the others stand there staring. We're men among men and manly men, yes, manly men are we. We're men among manly men, manly men are we. When we shoot him down, he'll get back up, so we'll shoot him down again. But he'll get back up, so we'll shoot him down, 'cause we are manly men. Yes, we are manly men. And a man's gotta do what a man's gotta do when a man is a man among men. Yes, a man among men's gotta do what a man's gotta do as a man among men. We'll hunt the black rhinoceros down on the plain so dry and hot. We'll blow him over and take his horn and leave the rest to rot. Yes, leave the rest to rot. And a man's gotta do what a man's gotta do when a man is a man among men. Yes, a man among men gotta do what a man's gotta do as a man among men. We'll take that horn and tell it to our Taiwanese connections. They'll grind it up into medicine so men can get erection. So men can get erection. And a man's gotta do what a man gotta do when a man is a man among men. Yes, a man among men gotta do what a man's gotta do as a man among men. We're men among men and manly men, yes, manly men are we. We're men among manly men are we. Come on, men, let's kill it. What are we, women?
All right, there you go. All right, we won't pray at the end of that. Why don't we just see you guys next week? Thanks for coming. And actually, we're going to be in Guatemala next week, but Phil will be here and Jamie will be here. So come out. See you later. Thanks for coming. Take it easy.